Welcome back to Hatoraid Live, the Hatoraid Hour podcast. I am your host, Jordan, aka Hatoraid Cowboy, and thank you to everybody that is tuning in on this Friday afternoon, evening. We are going to be talking about bass, and to do that, we bring in back Cody from Harbottle, the director. Cody, it's good to see you again, man.
Good to see you too, man. Thanks for having me.
Yes, sir. Yeah, we were just talking off screen, and I was like, I looked at the date for on our last stream. And I was like, man, it's been a year already, over a year and a month. So didn't mean for it to go that long. We talked about doing some kind of series of live streams talking about bass. So this is the part two, I guess you could say. So we're going to be talking about, do you really need a subwoofer? Now, if you're a home theater enthusiast, you already know the answer to that is yes. But for some of you that may be wondering, do I need a subwoofer? What situation do I need a subwoofer? What kind of subwoofer do I need? Do I need one, two, four? What's the size of the woofer? We're going to be talking about all of that stuff. So, Cody, for those that may be watching for the first time, you want to give everybody a brief intro of who you are and what you do with Harbottle?
I am the CEO and director of Harbottle Audio, and I design everything. Currently, we have a catalog of around 800 different subwoofers. To my knowledge, we have one of the largest catalogs on the planet. I'm not sure of anybody else that has anything more than that, but if there is somebody, reach out to me, let me know. Um, yeah, we're bass specialists. We cut our teeth back in the early 2000s in getting into bass, and it just kind of escalated over the last 20 years.
Okay. Did you say over 800?
Yeah.
That's insane. Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard of that before. I didn't know that, and I don't think I've ever heard of a company that has over 800. Now, is that 800 different type of like product name, like different like serial numbers, or is it just like configurations?
It's 800 different SKUs.
Wow,
So,
that's insane.
but a SKU can change from finish to finish too. So like that includes different colors, different finish types, materials, from carbon fiber. I think in the carbon fiber range we had four. Last time you and I talked, we had four, and now we're up to like 186 or something like that. And they're all
Wow.
customizable, so they can get changed and pushed and pulled and reconfigured into different um, formats in order for them to fit in different holes and spaces. What depending on what the interior designers put together. So yeah, but there's around 800 different SKUs now.
Wow.
Yeah,
That is pretty impressive.
it just kind of exploded. It just I was looking at how to put everything together in different ways and present it in a way that people could understand. And Cassini Tradition showed up, and then Cassini Carbon. So the Carbon series got moved into the Cassini lineup, and then now we're looking at Cassini Signature, which is a my personal take on subwoofering. Like um, the way that I like to do subwoofers is from like 100 hertz down. I don't really like to go above that because you know there's there's a lot of very good technology that allows for crossovers to happen around the 80 to 100 hertz mark. So it's better to, in my mind, my opinion, is better to focus that energy and that efficiency from 100 hertz down on a subwoofer, and really liven it up down there because that's what people are paying for, right? But then there's also broadband, you know, guys that have their favorite bookshelf speaker, but they want to add a subwoofer to it. And so they need something that's going to reach up to 150 or 160 hertz. So, it just started exploding when I started solving a lot of problems, for different people, different clients, different design considerations. And yeah, it just showed up 800 different SKUs. I was just shaking my head going, wow, That's a lot of gear, man.
Yeah, that's impressive. But hey, it means business is booming, and you're probably going to be busy for a good long time. So that's
Probably,
always good for business.
probably, yeah. Yeah, let's jump into this.
Yeah.
Ask your first question, dude.
Yeah. So, and by the way, guys, if you have any questions for Cody, he is a wealth of knowledge, not just on bass, but on, speaker technology, all that stuff. So make sure you drop your comments in. If you have any super chats, drop them in. We're going to go ahead and get started. So, first question. Oops, that's not the first question. Let me find. Here it is. So, when do you need a subwoofer?
One. Okay. Um, when you need a subwoofer is gonna rely on how hard you're pushing your audio system. So like I've got some vinyl in the background. I'm a two-channel guy as well as HT and all and everything. But I like my two-channel. I like stereo. And so when that actually matters, when you need to get into, you know, competent bass reproduction, is how it depends on how hard you're pushing your speakers. So I got it. Aaron's Audio Corner is actually a really good source of information for dissecting you know when that limit is going to be with your speaker, if to be able to see it on a graph.
I think you'll have
So
to
we
add it again too, because it's for some reason it's gone. So you have to present it again.
Okay, so I will share my screen. Okay, so this is a speaker that you and I were talking about, and I mean the the straight facts is that I don't necessarily agree with everything that every different um, institution or measurement service or measurement protocol will stipulate. Okay, but Aaron's Audio Corner does have some good information that can be used to draw some decent conclusions. I wouldn't say that you're going to absolutely hit bullseye every single time, because a measurement is just that it relates to itself, and then you have to understand that there's a little bit of wiggle room there for what's going to happen in room and in content playback. So this speaker is a good example. It's a floor standing speaker. We can see with the spinorama that below 100 hertz it jumps up like, oh, 8 dB or so. It just launches up, and then it starts to roll off pretty hard and heavy. Um, and that's all happening right around the 100 to 60 hertz mark. Now, most bass is interpreted down around the 30 mark, 30 hertz, as being deep and powerful. Okay. So now the next bit of information, we got some saturation and some polars and all of that, and that's all great and fine. But the next bit of information we want to look at is what he calls the dynamic range test, which is actually a very good word for it. Like, it describes it very well. It's the retention of your dynamic range when the speaker is being pushed throughout the band. And he limits out at 102 dB at 1 meter. So these are all 1 meter tests. So in room, it could be louder, it could be quieter, depending on the size of your room, and how hard you're going to push the unit in general. That contributes to the overall SPL. But this dynamic range is what's called compression. Okay. So in compression, we see that at 100 hertz, when you go above the blue mark, right? So this blue line here, that's a half a dB compression. It just starts to compress really hard below 100. Okay. And, but above that point, like, a little bit quieter listening levels, so 86 dB red, it compresses a bit, but then it jumps back up, and this could be any number of things. We'll just call it an anomaly. But technically speaking, you cannot have decompression. So like you can't put, X amount of wattage in, double it, and get more than 3 dB back. Like physics doesn't work that way. So decompression can't happen in the physical universe. So this is anomalous. Like there's something else going on in the enclosure. However, when we look at the behavior again, going all the way back up to the spinorama, we looked at the overall SPL, even though it's quote unquote decompressing, the overall SPL is dropping off. So now let's look at what the speaker is actually set for. And it's 88 dB sensitive on 4 ohms, which is kind of sensitivity is almost pointless, but what you want to look at is inductance linearity as it relates to the power applied. But we can see right here, we got a 4 ohm speaker on 50 watts. And that makes sense. If we look at compression, around 102 dB, this thing is starting to tap out. We're getting a dB and a half compression above 100 hertz. That's very audible. This 1 dB compression above the 200 hertz, probably not so much. I find it very difficult to hear. We don't reference anything above 1 dB compression as anything to worry about, or below 1 dB compression as anything to worry about. But, when you start getting into dynamic content, okay, so this is, I believe this is an RMS test. Right, 2.7 second logarithmic sine. Okay, so this would be an RMS test. So there's, we can see when we're hitting the 102 dB mark that it's running out of headroom. Like there's very little dynamic range left, and that makes sense because it's only a 50-watt speaker. So now, if you're going to use this kind of speaker where you're getting some compression, you're going to drive it closer to the 100 dB mark, yeah, you're going to want to think about adding in a subwoofer because the speaker just simply can't handle it really, and not much of anything below the 100 hertz mark because the dynamic range is going to fall off, right? Like if you want to push the speaker, it's going to suffer. So adding a subwoofer does make sense at that particular point. And that kind of it requires some legwork on the part of the consumer. I hate to kind of throw the ball back, at the client, or at the consumer, but it does. Like, get an SPL meter. Like the app on your phone isn't really going to cut it. I don't have my phone with me, or else I'd show you, but or I'd hold it up as an example. But the app on the phone isn't really going to cut it. Go and get an SPL meter, or if you've got REW and you have a microphone, understand that calibrating your microphone with an actual SPL calibrator, it's a little device that plugs onto the end of the microphone. You set it, it'll set a tone at 1,000 hertz. It'll play like 108 dB or 114 or 102 or whatever it's set to, and it'll play that tone, and you calibrate your mic, and you calibrate it, every time you use it, and then you can get some accurate readings. How loud am I listening? And that's a big question that has to be answered. And then when you should be looking at getting a subwoofer. Because if you take how loud you're listening in your room, do a tiny little bit of math, and get your SPL kind of, normalized to, what Aaron's Audio Corner or what the published specifications are, then you're in a position where you can start attacking the situation from knowledge and go, okay, well, the sound quality that's degrading, it doesn't sound right, is actually because I'm driving the speaker harder in the lower end than it can rightly deal with. So it does need a little bit of help. And that's the job of a subwoofer. Like if you look at the front of a speaker and you got your tweeter, your mid, and your bass driver, that's called a three-way speaker. Well, a subwoofer is your sub bass, and so you're adding another way to that loudspeaker. So now instead of a three-way, you have a four-way speaker. And getting that integrated into your system can be a bit complicated. There's actual, like, education systems for calibrators and integrators to, like with CDA and HTA, Home Theater Association, and so on, where they're able to, you know, work with these systems in real time in a room and start to get, the system dialed in really well for the client. And that's great. But if you don't know the fundamental of how loud you're listening and how loud you want to listen to, it's like, I could use, like, you turn it up and go, okay, well, this gained me 3 dB and it was this much more interesting or this much more explosive or dynamic or wonderful or whatever. It gives you actual numbers that are calibrated and real, and it allows you to make conscious, well-informed decisions as to when you need to get a subwoofer involved in your system. And for a lot of two-channel guys, they get scared of that because, and I'm one of them, I really didn't want anything to do with the subwoofer for ages, and now I manufacture them. But, like, it it's kind of like, you're taking something away, or, is it going to be a good enough quality? All those kinds of questions start showing up because you've got this great audio system and you don't really want to muck anything up, right? However, it's important to know, along with that question or answering that question, how loud you're listening, when do you need that subwoofer, how competent is your main speaker. Adding a subwoofer means that you're taking an incredible load, a very difficult thing, bass reproduction, and you're adding it into your system. And so, a good quality subwoofer does cost more money, and rightly so. If you look at it from a physics standpoint, it's doing a lot more work. It has a lot harder job. And so it does make sense that it would cost possibly as much as your main speakers would, because you're trying to extend the performance into the lower registers. How'd
Okay.
I do?
Excellent answer. So,
All right.
question then, because, and I know you covered this, but what about the people that say, well, I run my speakers full range? Now, I think personally for home theater, there's very little true full range speakers that you can buy that are for home theater. But let's say somebody does have like a true full range speaker, or, and I'm not talking about like, oh, let me go into the settings and select full
Pick
range, because,
large.
or large, yeah. So that's something else you see, and that was something that I didn't understand when I first got into home theater. I would see that and I'm thinking, oh, I have towers. That means my speakers are large. So let me turn this on. I had no
Mm.
clue that it meant full range speakers. So what do you say to the people that maybe really do have some full range speakers and say, I don't need a sub. I'm just gonna run all my speakers full range, large for my home theater. Would you still recommend adding an additional sub and taking that load off those full range speakers?
Come back to, how loud are they listening? If the sound quality is retained, here's the insidious thing about compression. Compression, it starts to, render issues in different kinds of distortion. Like everybody's familiar with, THD, right? And that's you know, from my standpoint as an engineer, THD is like the dullard of the group. I was just in um, Washington State, and I was doing some work with NWAA, and the 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 gentleman that runs the NWA, he's also one of the members of AES. And we had this huge discussion about AES 75 and AES 2 and a bunch of different testing protocols. And I just blurted out, like, THD is like yes, it's important as it relates to itself, and if it's loud enough so it's audible, then you got to deal with it. But outside of that, if it's not doing anything that's drastically horrible, just outside of all of it, just build a cleaner driver, or if it's an amplifier problem, deal with it in the amplifier. Like use better parts essentially. And compression adds distortion, but it's different kinds of distortion. Like one of the worst kinds of distortion that show up as a result of compression is called temporal distortion. And temporal distortion is never where you last left it, and it shows up very insidiously. Like I've said this before on different interviews, and it might have been with you last year. My memory isn't that great, but I think I might have said something to the effect of, compression is it'll start to sound warm, it'll start to sound a little bit thick, and some people like that. They interpret it as weight. They interpret it as like a nice weighty sound, and it gets a little softer, a little rounder around the edges, and it's not quite as crisp and tight, those kinds of things. Well, that's getting into temporal distortion problems. But then you also have dynamic distortion. And then, of course, obviously, you've got thermal distortion. But a lot of people look at thermal distortion and they say, okay, well, that's compression. It's part of compression, yeah, but it's not all of it. And then you've got bandwidth distortion. So those issues that start showing up in different kinds of distortion as a result of compression, well, like you have to look at, what kind of demand is being placed on the speaker itself. And that's where understanding how loud you're listening pays massive dividends. Like absolutely huge. You get an even okay microphone and a calibrator and you run some tests, it will pay you back for sure. And it's really not that expensive. So like from a 2-channel standpoint, yes, adding a subwoofer is, from my perspective, it's a great idea because there's a lot of infrasonics and subharmonic content from musical instruments that does show up in the low registers, and it adds context to what you're listening to. So from my perspective, yes, adding a subwoofer on any system is a great idea. However, it might not be for everybody, as like you mentioned, full range speakers, and understanding their character. And I mean, not to try to, pump business or anything like that, but, if the, like if guys like Aaron's Audio Corner and NWAA and, these facilities were doing full compression tests, like, the new AES 75 protocol is calling for. It's literally puts a compression limit at 2 dB. If that became a standard that all manufacturers adhere to strictly, then people would be able to look at their speakers and look at the published documentation and make very good decisions very quickly. They'd be able to draw very good conclusions, like the quality of what they're going to be making their decisions off of would just go up exponentially. But that also presents a problem from a marketing standpoint, because if a speaker is designed, engineered, and manufactured to a budget, like there's a hard ceiling, the accountants are involved, bang, thou shall not pass such and such a dollar point, well then it would be very obvious very quickly that the speaker is designed to a budget. But that doesn't mean, like one of the guys I follow, Cheap Audio Man, says, that doesn't mean it sounds bad. It can sound actually pretty good for what it is. You got to contextualize it though. And in this world where people tend to get on bandwagons and they draw very hard conclusions very quickly, the reasonableness of looking at a speaker and going, okay, yes, if I'm using it in this range, it's going to sound fine, and that's going to suit my purposes. The onus will always fall on the consumer to make the decision based on what they know and on the legwork that they've done. If they haven't done any legwork, it will show up. And that kind of gets sticky because there are people that honestly, they just don't know and they don't have the time to figure it out. And they don't have the interest to figure it out. They just want to be told what they want to hear. And whether it's through a designer, like an architect, or through a marketing firm or whatever, it doesn't it doesn't mean it's bad. I need to make that perfectly clear. It doesn't mean it's bad. It's a preference. And that preference has to be respected. So like if a guy is running a full range speaker, yeah, I could just say buy a subwoofer. But if the sound quality is really good and you have a good ear and you're listening critically, you're really like, yeah, this is nice and tight and crisp and I like it, great. If not, maybe do a little bit of searching around, or even if you're just curious, find a subwoofer or a subwoofer manufacturer that you identify with and see if you can get one on loan and get a calibration done, get it integrated as best as possible, without going totally overboard. Let's be reasonable about it and see, because it might suit your sensibilities and it might be a worthwhile investment if you got a good relationship with whoever you're buying your product from. If it's a store or if it's you got a good relationship with an online internet direct manufacturer or whoever, yeah, you'll be able to, wrangle a deal, so to speak. But it's not really wrangling a deal. It's just like investigative work, and there's nothing wrong with that, especially if it's something that you're considering. And yes, it's going to cost you some money. You want to make sure that, or for myself anyway, I always want to make sure that what I'm buying is going to suit my sensibilities. So it will come back to that question of, how loud are you listening? And, can you answer that question? And if you can't, there's nothing wrong with it. You just have to be okay with doing the exploratory work a different route, finding a different route, to get to your end goal.
Right, right. So compression with speakers, like, you said testing, look at the data if you can, test it. Is compression something that only shows up at the higher frequencies? Like with a sub, you get a sub, we know that it can distort if it's ported. If you can get some port chuffing if it's not designed well,
Compression.
or compression. So that's my next question. Does compression show up with subwoofers in the same way that it shows up with speakers at higher frequencies? Since, like you said, you only like to manufacture from 100 hertz down. How do you compression test a subwoofer?
Well, I got my subwoofers running all the way up to 250 hertz.
Oh, okay.
The signature series is my personal take. Like that's just
Gotcha.
a personal preference and what I like a subwoofer to do. This doesn't represent my company. Broad stroke sort of thing. Yes, subwoofers are definitely affected by compression. Like they have to move a long way. Like any subwoofer, I'm gonna try and type and talk. Um, any subwoofer will produce stroke because the resonant frequency is usually around 45 40 hertz on the driver, and from that resonant frequency down, the subwoofer will do what's called excursion limit. It'll only be able to go so far because that point, from that 50 hertz point down, it's all hardcore displacement, right? And I'm trying to pull up database, and I'm going to share some screens with you, but it's taking a while to load. Okay, here we go. I'm going to present this screen here. Database. Okay. So this is under the systems tab here. And he's got a whole bunch of DIY.
And what site is this?
Database.com.
Okay.
DATA-BASS.com. And um, I'm going to pick on myself because anything else would be completely and wildly unethical. Where does he have me? Oh, jeez. Oh, right. This is where this is my first driver. The judge, it was labeled under Ridge Audio. We've since dropped that.
Hmm.
But long-term output compression, one port open, compression magnitudes sealed. Okay. So, um, what we can see here is the compression magnitude, just like on the test results at um, Aaron's audio recorder. We can see um, the dynamic range or compression of this driver. This is an 18-inch. And right at maximum, so on the 118 dB sweep, you can see where my mouse is. That's 103 volts, and at 21 hertz, it's compressing 0.6 of a dB. And then right at maximum, 20 hertz, it's compressing 0.9 of a dB. And this is showing where the driver is running out of stroke. Now, this is the interesting part. Right here, where there's very little compression, this is the resonant frequency of the subwoofer, 25.269 hertz. There's very little compression. They all stack up really close to each other. They're not deviating hardly at all. Like max compression is 0.1 of a dB. Like that, there's no way you can hear that. And that's where the resonant frequency is. Now below that point where this driver is going to excursion limit and it's going to run out of stroke very quickly, we can see it starts to compress. But it compresses right at maximum. And this is the way our drivers are designed. They're designed to compress very linearly all together, kind of, in a cluster. This decompression, like I said before, this physically can't happen. So this could be an enclosure issue, or it could be a baseline measurement issue where the baseline measurement isn't, super duper accurate. However, you got to look at the maximum. So the maximum is like half a dB. Well, microphones, like measurement microphones are only that are calibrated and accurately made. They're an instrument, and they're only good within a dB. So this is a half a dB to a half a dB right in here. That is within the non-linearity of the microphone itself. So that's anomalous. You can't count it as part of the measurement because like the microphone can't measure more accurately than within a decibel. So anything that's anomalous, you have to ignore it just because of scientific principle. And but you can see the trajectory of the driver is that it compresses very linearly all the way up to 125 hertz or 120. Yeah, he's got it up to 119 here. But when you push a lot of power to it, 103 volts, that's when it starts to compress and you're really driving the subwoofer really hard. So yes, subwoofers, they can compress audibly right up to their maximum across their entire bandwidth. The part where it doesn't compress, that is where the driver is having the easiest time making audio. That's the resonant frequency of the system. And that's a clue to tell you, how well low-tuned and how directed that subwoofer is towards bass.
Interesting.
Make sense?
Yes, sir. Good to know.
Cool.
Okay, so you basically answered, does a subwoofer take the strain off your speakers? Next question: can multiple subwoofers give you more even bass versus a single sub? I think most people that are watching that have a home theater, you already know the answer to this question. But why would you want to have more than one subwoofer? Maybe even for two channel.
Because it's awesome.
It is awesome. Yeah, I can remember the first time I got two subwoofers, and it was so eye opening because you know I'd always heard about it. You know, I wasn't able to do it for a while, but I always heard about it. I was talking about how, multiple subs, but until you actually experience it, you're like in your own space, you're like, oh man, like this, I can't go back. I can
Yeah.
only add more. It's
Yeah.
it's pretty eye opening, and it's a pretty awesome experience, like you said, especially with, like movies that have a ton of bass that are action heavy. It's just a great experience. So why would you say you need to have multiple subwoofers versus one sub?
Um, it doesn't make integration or calibration easier. It
No.
probably makes it more difficult. However, the results are usually better. Like the room is going to sound and behave better overall. And that's the big that's the big sticking point. Like why are you adding a subwoofer? Well, to make things sound better, right? You want you want the bass to translate into something that sounds real, that is engulfing, engaging, that is all encompassing. You know, you comb through any audio fanatic um, forum, and everybody that's on the bass threads, they're always talking about how they want it to be more captivating, right? And that getting multiple subwoofers does that in a really really good way. It helps manage what's called room modes, and room modes are I actually deal with them, and they're actually a part of subwoofer design. Um, the same thing happens, like a room mode issue in a room when you're dealing with audio. The same thing happens inside the enclosure of the subwoofer. I don't think people really realize that. I had a couple conversations recently, and I said, well, the exact same thing happens inside the enclosure. It's just on a smaller scale. You've got room gain. You've got all kinds of things. Like if you take a microphone, put it inside an enclosure, and you light up a subwoofer, it's like unbelievably loud in there. And
Hmm.
it has its own gain. It has its own acoustic character. It's got all of that stuff. And so like the structure of the enclosure really matters, just like the structure of the room really matters, and the dimensions of the enclosure matter just like the dimensions of the room matter. So you've got two things that are related, and they're not necessarily competing with each other, but they can enhance the overall experience. And when you're dealing with modal constraints, like there's a cancellation, let's say it's an axial cancellation or tangential or whatever, and it's right at your MLP, and you can't move your speaker, or sorry, you can't move the speaker, and you can't move your couch or your HT theater or seating or whatever it is, your Eames lounge chair, whatever it is, you can't move it. That's where it is. A second, third, fourth subwoofer, they work together to balance the forces acting along that mode, or that mode of cancellation or excitement. Even like some rooms ring like a bell, and they just take off, and you've got to chop in a bell filter and cut out 50 dB just to get that particular frequency band to calm down, because it's just goes so loud and overtakes everything. And that doesn't really help the cause of sound quality. So multiple subwoofers can work to counteract that. And a really good case in point is like Trinov waveforming. You know, they've developed this technology. It's actually quite good. It does a very good job, and it creates a planar wave of bass off the front wall, and it's got absorption subwoofers on the back wall, active bass traps basically, and they're used to balance the modal issues inside the space. So from a home theater standpoint, that's a massive step towards sound quality. And if you look at it, you know, very analytically, when you're absorbing with active subwoofers, you're actively trapping bass on the back wall after you've created this planar wave. Well, now you're in a situation where what you're hearing, especially in the lower registers, if it's doing all the bass trapping like a dual bass array does, you're going to hear what the actual driver sounds like. And the more chatter it makes, the more different kinds of distortion it makes, the more noise you're going to get from the subwoofer itself. And that's where stroke matters. But stroke matters at any point within the subwoofer's workload, because there is so much content, and I can't stress this enough. There's so much content that creates subharmonic frequencies. So if you got a fundamental frequency of 50 hertz and it's creating two subharmonics down, so a second order subharmonic or a third order subharmonic, that takes you right down to 12 hertz. That's infrasonic territory. And that is where every subwoofer is going to be, like, it's going to be boogieing, like it's going to be moving massive amounts to create that 12 hertz. And so when the stroke is clean and there's very little harmonic issues getting in the way, temporal distortion and bandwidth and burst distortion and thermal distortions are all kept, you know, well in check. Well, what you're going to hear is what the subharmonic content is supposed to be doing. And yes, some of it's intentional in the mixing studios, and some of it isn't. Some of it just happens because they, you know, didn't have a subwoofer that was competent down to those infrasonic levels, and it just kind of got stuck in there anyway, but they didn't have a way to really know that it was there or how to work with it. And that's happened on a number of different films, you know, over the years. So, you know, you got to kind of take that a little bit with a grain of salt or two, you know, like it's not a hard and fast rule where all content is meant to be there. You know, there's some that happens by mistake. But having a subwoofer that's competent in stroke definitely leans towards how it's going to behave in the room and the sound quality that you're going to get, and how well it's going to work with your main speakers. So from my standpoint, I know I said this last year, my standpoint is that the subwoofer needs to shut up. Just shut up. Like, it should not sound like anything. It should be inert and just, you know, dead. Because what people pay for is that huge impact on the audible range, their main speakers. That's what they really pay for. Like, loudspeakers are not cheap, and they buy what they like. They buy they buy the thing that sounds the way they like it to sound. You know, like, you don't buy, like, somebody who's investing $100,000 in a home theater audio system isn't buying just whatever speakers because, you know, whatever. That's not really the attitude. There's, you know, a designer involved, and they're picking a sonic signature that's going to hit a certain kind of response. And usually, like with the designers that I work with, they all say the same thing. The client goes out, they want to listen to the main speakers because they want to get a sense of what it's going to sound like, and they want to have that kind of control. And that's what the subwoofer is supposed to do. So getting multiple subwoofers that take that strain off, and even take the strain off of each other, does nothing but help the entire system. Like, really, like, it's a win-win-win-win. Like, at every point down the road, you're winning unless the calibration and integration is done by a complete imbecile and is throwing on like 30 different bell filters and is just like boosting and cutting all over the place with overlapping stuff. You know, you don't want that because now your amplifier can, it doesn't know what, how much power to put out, and it's just being pushed and pulled in so many different directions. But if the integration work, you know, the room is designed well, the room work integration, and then the calibration and integrating that subwoofer into the overall system is done even with a decent level of competency. You know, DIY even. Like, you don't have to be a total pro to get a respectable result. A pro will get a professional result. A respectable result can be done by a guy, you know, watching some YouTube videos and running through some of the forums and asking some questions. And you can get a really, really good sounding system just by adding like, you know, 2 or 4 subwoofers of very respectable dollar value. Like, you don't have to buy ultra high end. Like, you don't have to get into the Cassini realm to get good sound. That's what I'm saying. And I mean, I know I just shot myself in the foot. Boom. You know, like, but you don't. And I've gone on, I've said this on AVS, I don't know how many times. If I wasn't doing what I'm doing, I know that I would have rhythmic subwoofers. You know, I've heard them. They sound good. They work within a range. Don't drive them too hard because they do like to compress. But they're designed to in order to get, in order to favor a linear response. So they do start to compress and it looks like it's on power. And, you know, from the rhythmic that I've heard, they sound decent up to their limit. And then I would probably have like 6 of them, you know, because bass is cool, right? You know, like
Right.
it's just, you know, my taste. But, you know, like that's what I would do. And so yeah, multiple subwoofers is a great way to go. Like, it's not foolproof though, and it's not easy. You know, if the room is difficult, you know, the challenges can start to mount up. Getting that crossover dialed in just right to your main speakers, like getting that crossover point just perfect, getting your time domain dealt with properly, that's challenging, but it works. And that can really increase the sound quality of your main speakers and your subwoofer as well, if you get that just in that sweet spot.
Yeah.
And that's how you do it. Like, the 2 things that I tell people to do when they're dealing with time domain: experiment with all pass filters on the subwoofer at the crossover frequency or around the crossover frequency, and listen to the sound quality. It's something that the graph will not show you unless it's a massive like cancellation. Throw an all pass filter in and then boom, the response flattens out and it doesn't sound so wobbly. That's one thing that can happen, is between the difference between the main speaker and the subwoofer. If that crossover isn't just perfect, it can sound wobbly. Like the bass can, or the sound can be kind of all over the place a little bit and a little disconcerting. Like, it sounds off, like something's wrong. So that's something that you can see, but sound quality doesn't necessarily translate to a perfectly flat graph. There are some sound quality, like really good sound quality speakers, that don't have perfectly flat graphs. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that if it sounds good. So getting that time domain dealt with is like absolutely perfect. That's something that you want to look at. Explore all pass filters and then start, and don't, like, tape measures are fine to deal with your delay between your subwoofer and your main speakers, but that should just to rough in the subwoofer. That's just to rough it in. Then you want to fine tune it and look at your overall response. Pink noise is a great thing to work with. I work with pink noise all the time. That's how we do our internal testing, is with pink periodic. and it really, it taxes things pretty hard, especially if you got it cranked up. But it's a really good test. It's very linear, and so you can look at the RTA on REW, so the real time analyzer. You can see it change as you're applying delay and taking delay away. You can see the behavior on the graph change, especially if you've got it so it's stable. Like it will freeze your peak or freeze your average, and it'll create a line with whatever color. I usually have mine set to red because it stands out against the black screen. That's just me. And it'll freeze that and it'll hold it. And when you apply delay, it could start to change it, and you reset it and start over again, and then you can see the graph start to even itself out. So applying that delay, those are the two things you need to worry about when you're dealing with your crossover point. And then from there, it's moving that crossover around to get a nice looking graph. That's where you actually want your graph to look nice, is when you're moving the crossover around, up the frequency, down the frequency. Don't be married to 80 hertz. It's not set in stone. The crossover is there mainly to deal with the weaker of the two speakers. If your main speaker is weaker in the low end, then the subwoofer is weaker in the top end, then you want to bias your main speaker. And you want to absolutely get that main speaker. Thanks, Kevin Gardner. I just see your message. Thanks, dude. You want to get that time alignment and the crossover point set up so this main speaker can perform at its best. And then the subwoofer, because it's stronger, will be able to reach out and do its work, and it's not going to be laboring in such a way that is as noticeable as if you're trying to push the loudspeaker harder by making it reach down further into the lower registers. So let's say 80 is too much for that loudspeaker, so you go to hit 100, and all of a sudden the loudspeaker sounds perfect and sweet, and the subwoofer is still strong, and it can blend in nicely to your loudspeaker. Boom, job done.
So, question on that. So, talk about blending speakers or blending your subs with your speakers. Along that line, woofer size versus number of subs. So, if you have,
I like this one.
blending, like you were saying, blending the subs with the speakers. What if you have, well, let's say somebody says, well, I don't have the room. Maybe the person just doesn't have the room to put multiple subs, and they say, I have the choice of either a 21-inch sub or two 15s. So would you say, what would you recommend to someone if they said, hey, I only have this choice, bigger woofer, one sub, or maybe multiple subs, but smaller drivers?
Shoot.
I mean, I think this is a real
It's real.
scenario for a lot of people that,
It's real.
either they don't have the space, or maybe their wife is like, hey, I don't want to see a bunch of subs everywhere. I mean, now you have more options with in-wall subs, on-wall subs, Perlison's making some really cool stuff with that. But
Yeah.
for persons like, man, right now I can either do one big sub or maybe a couple smaller subwoofers.
I would say if you're going to go to one subwoofer, get the baddest subwoofer you can.
Yeah.
Because what you're gonna do if you're walking away from multiple subwoofers and going to a single or whatever, is you want to counter what could happen with multiple subs. You want to counter that with just straight up horsepower. Like this is a horsepower versus handling question. That horsepower, like, just flat out full on displacement. That will help you in SPL that can help you, not will, it can help you deal with some of those room mode issues just by being able to overcome the room mode with enough SPL. And then you dial the system down to look after the blending aspect to your main speakers and get that get the performance, kind of congruent, so it's not like this untamed beast in the corner of the friggin' room. Is it has some kind of composure to it. But multiple subs, if you can do multiple subs, it's not that it's a better way to do it in all cases. Like you said, if a guy just doesn't have the room for multiple subs, I get it, you know. But if you got room for one big one, you make it a big bad subwoofer that can really hit hard, and it's got
What, what
some wicked SPL behind it. Because then you can overcome room modes with, just straight up brute force and ignorance.
what would you
And
say a minimum size? Like as you said, get the biggest baddest. What would be your minimum size that you would start with? One big sub.
one
18, 21.
Well, in my room, I've got my room is 24 by 16 by 8,
Oh wow, it's
and
pretty
I
big.
have a single 12,
Hmm.
and I hit like 130 dB.
Wow, that's
Mind
crazy.
you, my 12 is mine, and it's
Right.
absolutely ridiculous. So it really depends on what your goals are. Like, like, again, going back to question one, how loud are you listening, right? And so that's relative as far as size goes. Like, I would say for most people between 18 and 24 for a single unit, depending on the size of the room. And then of course the placement, like how good is it going to work in that room in general. If there's only one place to put it, and it's just like the worst place in the entire room, and like it's just everything is just stacked against it, and it can't get good like at all, then yeah, the bigger the better, and hopefully you can kill some of those room mode issues with just straight up, power. Outside of that, you know, multiple subwoofers is always a really good, really good suggestion.
Okay.
I got a
We have a
question.
comment question here. Says alignment under 2 milliseconds is key to get tight bass. Do you agree, Cody?
Alignment under 2 milliseconds. Well, that has to do with the physical space. So, and then of course there's like delay factors just within the system itself. So, you know, maybe. I mean, if he's talking, if Kevin, if you're talking about how 2 milliseconds relates to placement, like getting all the speakers placed properly, you'll get, somewhere in that 2 milliseconds aspect. Well, then yeah, it shows that you've got, like really good placement of all your speakers, and the room is designed well. But there are cases where you can get really good sound, and the subwoofer can be, 20 feet away and delayed really, really hard, or the main speakers can be delayed really, really hard. So, you know, everything works well together and can still sound really good because time doesn't affect amplification. So as far as like the amplifier running out of juice, the only thing that really matters is in time is the virtual memory on the DSP. If the DSP memory, like the virtual memory and hanging on to information, stalling it for X amount of time, and then releasing it, if that transaction is sloppy, that can sound sloppy, and that's a DSP issue. So like with our DSPs, we have them made for us out of Europe. So they're really, they can be used in stadiums, for 50,000 people, and deal with massive arrays like base arrays and loudspeaker line arrays, all kinds of stuff. So they work in a lot of different circumstances, and then you scale that down to consumer grade, where quality and maybe quality control can be a little bit loosey goosey. Then yeah, your time alignment can sound a little odd if you're pushing the virtual memory a little too hard, for what the unit can actually do in real time.
All right. Well, we are just at about an hour, so we're probably going to close up. But just to cover, I know this is something that's always big with all these companies now and everything that's happening. Uh, Tariffs and inventory. Does that affect Harbottle at all if people want to purchase your products?
Mm, Only on the custom product, like our carbon series. They're made to order, and usually there's something crazy that the customer wants. So the time frame on those, the lead time on those is 6 months to 12 months. Everything else, like, is all um, run through our distributor, Acoustic Frontiers, in the Bay Area in California, and they have stock. So that's inventory is looked after. There's a decent amount of inventory available. And then as far as tariffs go, well, we're tariff exempt because we're actually produced in Canada, so we conform to CUSMA, or what was CUSMA. Now it's USMCA, I think it's called. So all of our subwoofers come with a certificate, or well, they don't really need the certificate because they fall under that description in shipping anyway, and so they're tariff exempt. Because we don't import, like, we have to manufacture within a percentage within Canada, and we're also technology based, so it's all tech, and for productions in Canada. So the percentage that lies outside of Canada is like between nil and none, and so it falls under that description. So they're tariff exempt. So anybody who's wondering, that is that's the deal.
Good to know. Well, guys, we hope you enjoyed the stream today, talking about subwoofers. We all love bass. A lot of us that are watching are bass heads, so it's good to get some insight and some information from somebody who actually manufactures them, makes them. I've heard Harbottle, well, one time at Doyle's Home Theater. I mean, I think we talked after that, and I think you said he was maybe using like less than 5% of what it could actually do. I mean, we went
Yeah.
up to it. We were like, is it actually move? Like, we had to put our hand on it just to make sure. We're like, oh yeah, it's working. It's just, it didn't have to work hard at all. So, you know,
That's no compression, baby.
yeah, that's awesome. Rob says, thank you again, Cody, for sharing so much wisdom. Your subs are legendary. I heard it one at Doyle's house too. Yeah, so that's probably the same one that he heard. And surprisingly enough, Doyle's gotten rid of everything. He doesn't have his home theater anymore, so it's all gone. Yeah, it's gone.
What's he
So
into now? Cars, motorcycles?
no,
Yeah.
just yeah.
Fishing.
I know. I talked to him. I think it was last year. He was like, man, he's like, I just not long after I did the second updated tour, he was just like, I'm pretty much the only one in here. Like, my family, my kids don't really come here very much. And he's like, it's just kind of not fun anymore. So he sold he sold everything. It's like he don't even have the theater anymore. So, but
Oh man. Well,
yeah, I have gotten a chance to hear it, and yeah, it's pretty impressive what your subs can
well,
do.
there is our rep in Austin that's got that open invitation for you to come and audition his
Yeah,
system.
I
So
need to try to get with them at some point. But
yeah, Jeff
yeah, man.
Marriott.
Well, try to have you back on again. Hopefully, it won't be a year next time in between.
No worries, dude. No worries. I
So,
know you're busy. You're a popular guy.
nah, I wish. But yeah, man, thanks everybody for watching. If you have any other thoughts or comments, drop them in the comment section afterwards. I know last time Cody was, pretty active in there if somebody asked him a question. So feel free to drop some comments. And thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you either in the next video or the next live stream.
See you, everyone.